It started the day. A simple choice turned into a neighborhood nightmare. One resident thought they were free to enjoy their own property, but the HOA had other plans. What began as a petty complaint spiraled into a power struggle filled with threats, fines, and unthinkable retaliation. Suddenly, every trip outside felt like walking into enemy territory, and every letter in the mailbox carried a new warning. But the real shock came when the tables finally turned, leaving the HOA scrambling to explain itself. How far would you go to fight back when the place you call home becomes a battlefield? At first, life in the neighborhood felt almost picture-perfect. The lawns were neatly trimmed, kids rode their bikes in circles until the sun dipped low, and the houses stood side by side like a carefully painted postcard. For the homeowner, moving here had been a dream finally realized. A quiet street, a safe place for family, and a fresh start surrounded by people who seemed friendly enough. The early days were filled with simple joys. Morning walks with a cup of coffee, waving to neighbors while checking the mail, and slowly making the house feel like home. There was pride in every improvement, from planting flowers near the walkway to setting up a small patio out back. Nothing seemed out of place. Nothing seemed threatening. But as the weeks passed, small signs began to surface that hinted at trouble ahead. A neighbor's stare held just a little too long. A note left on the door carried a tone far colder than it should have. And then a quiet conversation with someone down the block revealed something more unsettling. A whisper about how the HOA watched everything, from the color of shutters to the way a yard was arranged. For now, life went on as normal. But beneath the surface, an invisible tension was already building. The homeowner had no idea that the smallest choice, the tiniest act of independence, would soon set off a chain of events that would change everything about living in this community. The first real sign of trouble came in a letter, folded neatly, tucked into the mailbox, and dressed up with official HOA letterhead. It almost looked harmless, but the words inside carried sting. The homeowner was told that the flowers planted along the walkway were non-compliant with community landscaping standards. It seemed absurd. They were just flowers, bright, cheerful, and carefully tended. Yet somehow, they had become the first shot in a war that no one had expected. At first, it felt like a misunderstanding. Surely, a conversation would clear things up. But the second letter arrived before the first could even be addressed. This time, it wasn't just a warning. It was a fine, a charge for breaking rules the homeowner didn't even know existed. The sense of pride that had come with improving the house quickly turned into dread each time the mailbox creaked open. Soon, the complaints began to pile up. The color of the shutters was too bold. The trash bins weren't brought in quickly enough. Even the small patio furniture, chosen for comfort and not for show, was flagged as unsightly. Each notice felt more like harassment than enforcement. What had once been a safe haven now felt like hostile ground. The homeowner tried reasoning. Calls were made, emails sent, polite requests for clarification written carefully, as if choosing the wrong word might spark more punishment. But the responses were cold, dismissive, and designed to intimidate. Every effort to comply seemed to backfire, with new rules being quoted, new bylaws being twisted, new accusations appearing out of nowhere. It wasn't just about flowers or furniture anymore. It was about control. The HOA seemed determined to break the spirit of anyone who dared to stand out. And the neighbors, once friendly, began to pull away. Some whispered apologies in passing, quietly admitting they had faced similar treatment. Others avoided eye contact altogether, afraid of drawing attention to themselves. Then came the night of the confrontation. A board member appeared at the door, clipboard in hand, rattling off violations with a smirk that said this wasn't about rules at all. It was personal. The homeowner stood there, gripping the doorknob, pulse racing, torn between anger and disbelief. How could something as simple as enjoying your own property lead to this? But just when it seemed the pressure couldn't get worse, it did. A lien notice arrived, threatening the very home that had once been a dream. The fines had stacked so high that the HOA was now claiming the right to seize the property if they weren't paid. The air grew heavy with fear and frustration. Sleepless nights piled up, every creak of the floorboard reminding the family that their home, their sanctuary, was no longer safe. Each day brought a new letter, a new threat, a new demand. And yet, deep inside, something else was starting to grow. It was resolve. The homeowner realized that giving in would mean losing everything, not just the house, but the right to live without being crushed by petty power plays. And so, while the HOA kept tightening its grip, the homeowner quietly began to prepare. Documents were gathered, conversations with lawyers whispered over the phone, every shred of evidence carefully saved. The HOA thought they had the upper hand. But what they didn't know was that every unfair demand, every cruel letter, every ridiculous fine was building a case, one that could turn their entire power structure upside down. The breaking point came in a way no one could have predicted. After months of intimidation, fines, and late-night threats disguised as official notices, the HOA finally made its boldest move. They called a community meeting, announcing that the homeowner would be addressed in front of everyone. The notice was worded like an execution order, a public display meant to humiliate and crush the spirit of anyone who dared to resist. That night, the community hall was packed. Neighbors filed into metal folding chairs, some whispering nervously, others wide-eyed, waiting to see a spectacle. At the front of the room sat the HOA board, lined up like judges at trial. Their president leaned forward, papers stacked in a neat pile, ready to read off every supposed violation. The homeowner walked in with a folder clutched tightly under one arm. Heart pounding, palms damp, they could feel every eye in the room following their steps. The HOA thought they had set the stage for total humiliation, but what they didn't know was that tonight would be different. The president began his tirade. He spoke of unauthorized landscaping, excessive noncompliance, and repeated disregard for community standards. Each accusation was delivered with smug satisfaction, punctuated by the sound of papers slapped against the table. Gasps and whispers rippled through the crowd. It was a performance, one meant to destroy. But when he finally paused, waiting for the homeowner to bow their head in shame, something unexpected happened. The homeowner stood tall, opened their folder, and began to speak. Calmly at first, but with a steady, growing confidence. One by one, they pulled out copies of emails, letters, and even photographs. Proof that the so-called violations had been fabricated, rules applied selectively, fines issued outside of legal boundaries. The audience leaned forward, stunned. The smug smiles of the board began to falter. And then came the bombshell. From the bottom of the folder, the homeowner revealed a letter from their attorney, a cease and desist order addressed directly to the HOA. It cited harassment, abuse of power, and violations of state property law. If the HOA continued their campaign, they wouldn't just lose credibility, they could lose everything, including their ability to operate at all. The room fell silent. The president stammered, his once commanding voice cracking under the weight of the evidence. Neighbors who had once looked away now stared openly, realizing for the first time that the fear that ruled their street wasn't unshakable. Then came the turning point. The homeowner read aloud the clause that mattered most. The board had no authority to enforce several of the fines they had issued. Every dollar they had demanded, every lien they had threatened, was built on sand. Gasps turned into murmurs. Murmurs grew into whispers of disbelief. The HOA's fortress of power had been struck at its very foundation. And then, the final blow, the homeowner, voice steady and unflinching, declared that they were prepared to take the case to court. Not only that, but they had gathered testimony from other residents who had been wronged in similar ways. This wasn't just a personal fight anymore. It was a reckoning. The board sat frozen, faces pale, unable to mask the panic. The community, once silent and subdued, erupted into a chorus of murmurs and side conversations. For the first time, people weren't afraid to speak up. The tide had turned. In that single night, the balance of power shifted. The HOA had set the stage for a public humiliation, but instead, they were the ones left exposed, stripped of authority, trembling under the weight of their own arrogance. But perhaps the most powerful shift wasn't on paper. It was in the spirit of the neighborhood itself. Residents began to wave again, this time with genuine warmth instead of anxious hesitation. Conversations blossomed on sidewalks. Friendships rekindled across fences that had once divided more than property lines. The fear that had hung over the community like a heavy shadow finally began to lift. There was, of course, lingering damage. Trust in the HOA system had been shattered, and not every neighbor was ready to forgive. Some worried that another board could rise, eager to seize power again. But there was also something new, a determination among the residents to never let fear dictate their lives again. Meetings were no longer sparsely attended or controlled by a select few. They were crowded, filled with voices that demanded transparency, fairness, and accountability. The homeowner, once targeted as an outcast, became a symbol of resilience. Not because they had sought the fight, but because they had refused to be broken by it. And in that refusal, they inspired others to stand taller, to question more, and to believe that a single person could spark real change. As the months passed, the story became legend in the community. New residents heard it whispered as both a warning and a promise. That power can be abused, but can also be challenged. That no rule, no board, no authority is above accountability. And perhaps that is the lasting impact, the knowledge that what begins as petty control can escalate into cruelty, but also that courage can break the cycle. Looking back, the homeowner often wondered if it had been worth the sleepless nights, the stress, the endless battles over paper-thin rules. But the answer was always the same: yes. Because in fighting back, they hadn't just protected their own home. They had restored a sense of freedom to an entire neighborhood. In that single night, the tide had turned, but the story didn't end there. What followed was a wave of consequences that would reshape the neighborhood forever. The morning after the fateful meeting, the board silence spoke louder than any of their threats ever had. For the first time, residents felt emboldened to speak openly. Neighbors who had once cowered behind drawn curtains began knocking on the homeowner's door, offering quiet words of thanks. They shared their own stories: fines for minor landscaping choices, threats for leaving holiday lights up a day too long, harassment for things as small as parking slightly crooked in a driveway. Each account painted the same picture: a board that had thrived on fear and silence. But now, silence was no longer an option. Within weeks, several homeowners banded together to file formal complaints, attaching their names to a growing case against the HOA. The legal cease and desist had done more than halt the harassment. It had revealed the fragility of the board's so-called authority. The once untouchable figures who sat at the front of every meeting now faced a barrage of scrutiny, their every action dissected by both lawyers and angry residents. The president, who had once barked orders with arrogance, suddenly appeared less frequently. Rumors swirled that he was seeking personal legal counsel, scrambling to protect himself from the fallout. Other board members resigned quietly, unwilling to weather the storm. And those who remained? They no longer spoke with the same swagger. Every word was cautious, every decision questioned. For the homeowner, the transformation was nothing short of vindication. The very people who had tried to strip away their pride in homeownership were now the ones stripped of power. The liens were dismissed, the fines erased, and the violations permanently voided. What had once been painted as rebellion was now recognized for what it truly was: a fight for fairness. The homeowner closed the folder with a sharp snap, the sound echoing through the hall. They didn't need to say another word. The silence of the board, the shock on their faces, and the whispers of the neighbors told the story better than anything else could. The battle wasn't over yet, but one thing was certain: the HOA would never hold the same grip on this neighborhood again. And as the homeowner walked out of that room, every step was heavy with vindication. The very people who had tried to break them had just watched their own power collapse before their eyes. The war had reached its peak, and now, all that remained was to see how the fallout would shape the future of the community. The HOA had once seemed invincible. Now, it was a cautionary tale. And for anyone listening, For anyone who has ever felt crushed under the weight of unfair rules and unchecked authority, the lesson is clear. You don't have to accept it. You don't have to bow your head and let injustice take root where you live. Because sometimes standing your ground doesn't just save your home, it saves your community.